of the day. Our special thanks to our series sponsors, which are AT&T, Cigna, and Noel Johnson Insurance. We are so glad that they help us offer this type of information to our businesses throughout the state. We've collected your questions during registration, so we will get to all of those, but we also encourage you to use the chat function and add to the conversation. When you do that, there's a drop down there so that you can send that question to attendees and panelists rather than just panelists. That way everybody can see your question and add on, and we can start having a vibrant chat box. So that would be helpful. Today, we welcome the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer, Neil Bradley. Neil has spent 2 decades working directly with congressional committee chairs and other high-ranking policymakers to achieve solutions. At the U.S. Chamber, Neil is responsible for aligning the organization's overall policy priorities and advocacy efforts. So I'm going to pass the Zoom mic over to Neil and have you start.
Well, thanks, Betsy. It's great to be with you all again. I think it was last November when we had an opportunity to get together. And, you know, I don't know whether like a month feels like a day or a day feels like a year anymore. It's just, I think time has just kind of become discombobulated. But the pace of things and how much they've changed since the last time we got together really does give us a lot to talk about. From the makeup of the federal government, obviously a new administration and a new Congress, a new COVID relief package, and an economy that today looks a lot different than it looked in November, and certainly looked a year ago when we entered lockdowns and kind of began this crazy year of 2020. I want to start with the most recent action and talk a little bit about the COVID package. And I'd love to talk about some of the other things that we expect kind of post-COVID with respect to federal policy, and then talk a little bit about where, from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, we see the national economy and some opportunity and some challenges. So let's start with this COVID package. It is an eye-popping, almost unbelievable headline number, $1.9 trillion. This is the fifth of the major COVID-related packages that's been enacted into the law in just a year. And you know, interestingly, this is the first one that became more partisan. So it was passed on a party line basis in the House and in the Senate. It's also one that looks a little bit differently in terms of its constitutional parts to it, you know, the things that make it up, than maybe some of the prior packages. And so, you know, this particular package is really focused on things that Congress couldn't come to an agreement on in some of those earlier packages. So it has a lot less relief, for example, for businesses and even small businesses, although some important things that I want to come back in a second and talk about, and much more focus on state and local governments and individual assistance. In fact, the bulk of this bill, leaving aside the about $160 billion that's used to turbocharge vaccinations, everything from, I suspect this may be important in Vermont, mobile rural vaccination clinics. You know, as we have more supply coming online, you know, mass vaccination centers that you see across the country don't work everywhere. And so you need other tools to be able to reach people in more rural areas. And this provides a lot of funding to help with that, to supporting the National Guard, which is being effectively deployed in a lot of places to help with vaccinations. And we know that we're going to even need more utilization of those type of resources when supply really accelerates over the next 6 weeks, as we fully anticipate. But it also included a lot of money for government that had been a point of contention in the past. There's about $350 billion that is split between state and local governments. Before we joined, I looked at the current estimate for Vermont's share. It's just over $1 billion in fairly unrestricted assistance. This became a big point of contention in DC because one of the things that we've seen over the last year is, just as we've had a K-shaped economic recovery, some businesses doing quite well, other businesses suffering, Some states are actually doing just fine. I talked to our counterparts, Betsy, in California at the end of last week. They're sitting on something like a $15 billion surplus, on top of which they're going to get $26 billion out of this bill. And so you compare that to other states like Hawaii and Louisiana, which are really in budget crunches just because of the nature of their economy and how they fund their government. And so a lot of what's coming out of this bill is how the various states are going to put that money to use. They can use it for everything from direct COVID response to replenishing revenue that dried up or that came in lower than estimates as a result of the pandemic, to launching their own small business programs to help small businesses. They can also use it for broadband and water and wastewater infrastructure. And so I suspect in state capitals kind of all across the country over the next year, there's really going to be real fights about how to utilize those monies there. Other major components are individual assistance. Last spring, as part of the CARES Act, there were stimulus checks that went out to every family earning as a family jointly less than 150,000, as an individual less than 75,000. There were $600 checks as part of the December package. Now there's an additional $1,400 checks for those who qualify, 75,000, 150,000. There's also a lot of tax provisions, a real bump up in the child tax credit, including refundability for low-income families as part of this, an expansion of the earned income tax credit for low-income workers that's a part of this, and all of that really designed to help individuals who are suffering as part of the pandemic. And that's over and above what was done on unemployment assistance, an extension of the federal unemployment benefits through the first week in September, including the additional $300 supplement on top of what an individual otherwise qualifies for under their state unemployment program. And so that means about 1 in 4 nationally unemployed individuals will actually collect more from unemployment assistance than they collected in earnings in their prior jobs. So a lot of assistance flowing out of this. Let's talk about what it means for business for a second. If some of the prior programs were really focused on things like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Employee Retention Tax Credit, the big new centerpiece of this bill is a provision directly targeted to the restaurant industry. So $28 billion just for grants for restaurants. It's not for the national chains. It can be for franchisees, but it's not for publicly traded companies with lots of locations. In fact, you can't have more than 20 locations. And it's not a loan. It's actually a direct grant. And if for anyone who's listening in today who's in the restaurant industry or the bar industry or in catering, or you have a tasting room, you really want to pay attention to this, because the amount of the grant is essentially your 2019 gross receipts minus your 2020 gross receipts. So just think about how much revenue you foregone in 2020 because of the pandemic, and that amount up to $5 million per location, $10 million overall, is what you can receive in a grant. And the first tranche is targeted to restaurants and establishments with less than $500,000 in receipts. And so it's once this gets stood up by the Small Business Administration, which, by the way, is probably at least a month or more away because they have to create the infrastructure for this. But it really is going to make a meaningful difference in helping a lot of restaurants survive. The PPP is largely unchanged. There's some small changes for large nonprofits, but largely it looks the same. The other big change is something that I'm a big fan of, and I kind of preach everywhere I go, and that's the Employee Retention Tax Credit. The Employee Retention Tax Credit essentially says if you have 500 or fewer workers, and the calendar quarter that's applicable, we're in the first calendar quarter of 2021. If your receipts are 20% or more below what they were in 2019, then you can get up to $7,000 per employee as a refundable tax credit paid to you to help you offset those losses. And so, it's a pretty generous program, $7,000 per employee per quarter in any quarter in which your gross receipts are off by 20% or more. And you can take that and take a PPP loan. You can take that and take the benefits under that restaurant provision that I just talked about. And this bill extends that program through the end of the calendar year. So if you think about this, if your business is off 20% consistently over the course of this year, that's up to $28,000 per employee that the government's going to send you a check for, which obviously can make a real meaningful difference for a lot of small businesses. So if that's kind of the COVID package, what everyone wants to know, kind of, well, what's next? That sounds good, but is there something else on the horizon? I think at the moment, the only realistic thing that's on the horizon is an extension of the PPP deadline. The current PPP program expires on March 31st. I'm really confident that over the next week and a half, Congress will clear an extension that will extend the deadline to the beginning of June, so an additional 2 months for businesses to apply, either for an original PPP loan or a second draw loan. That's really going to be important for that second draw loan for businesses who maybe haven't quite been able to get to that yet, or they haven't exhausted their first PPP. And that'll be an important benefit. But beyond that, I think we're kind of nearing the end of the COVID packages. Of course, that doesn't mean we're nearing the end of major legislation. So now that the pandemic relief bill is behind, everyone's asking, well, what's next on Capitol Hill? What will Congress turn its attention to? Most likely in the near term is actually a China issue that's going to draw a lot of bipartisan interest. We know about the economic and national security threats that China poses to the United States. We've seen some of the vulnerabilities, including in this pandemic, but also in everything from circuit boards, which are in short supply and slowing up the manufacturing of automobiles here in the US, of concern about our exposure of our supply chain in places like China. And there's going to be a major initiative, probably starting in the Senate, to address some of these economic and national security vulnerabilities. It won't try to totally reset the US-China relationship, but it will point to these critical areas and say, what do we need to do to make sure that we're making things here in the United States or in allied countries so that we're less vulnerable to some of those dangers. After that, infrastructure is high on the priority list. I feel bad every time I do one of these and I mention infrastructure. Everyone is like, yeah, that's what we hear all the time. It kind of feels like Lucy in the football, if you will. I do think this time is a little different. And I know everyone says that every time, but let me give you a little bit of reason to think that this is different. When we turned the calendar and started this new year, we launched an initiative along with lots of other chambers and business organizations, and frankly, labor and environmental groups. And we said, there's a lot of things that, particularly between labor and environmental groups in the business community, we might disagree with on specifics, but we're all coming together to join a call to get a major infrastructure bill enacted into law by the 4th of July. We called it Build by the 4th of July. And I got to tell you, when we first started talking about this publicly in January, people laughed. They were like, really? The 4th of July? Are you serious about this? Have you seen how well Congress is functioning? Well, lo and behold, the Senate Infrastructure Committee, their chairman, Senator Carper from Delaware, has announced that they intend to have a bill, in fact, 2 bills through by Memorial Day. Not to be outdone, the House Infrastructure Committee said, well, we're going to get it done earlier than that in May. You've kind of hit a button when you read, we have all these, we call them rags in DC. It's basically all these Politico and now Punchbowl and all these other things that report on the comings and goings of Washington. They trade and rumor. But you've gotten somewhere when they just report it as conventional wisdom. And they started reporting that conventional wisdom is the infrastructure bill by the 4th of July. That still may be a little bit ambitious, but I think we'll be on track to get something enacted by the 4th of July. Everyone wants to know how big it's going to be and what's going to be in it. those are things we don't know yet. I like to say it's going to be bigger than a lot of people on the right would prefer, and it's going to be smaller than a lot of people on the left are going to prefer. And somewhere in the middle, that's probably about right in terms of the infrastructure that we need and what we can afford to finance. Beyond infrastructure, I think immigration and workforce issues are going to be paramount. Later this week, the House is going to move forward on a bill to protect the Dreamers, a permanent resolution there, and also an ag workers bill. I think these are the first of two of potentially many immigration related provisions to finally kind of get our immigration policy right sized. Of course, the real danger here is that gets tied up in what we're seeing on the southern border right now. If there's anything that can derail that, politics can quickly seep into immigration. It can become difficult to get things done. I think it's also important to spend a moment talking about the environment in which we're operating in. It's a 50-50 Senate. I mean, you all have Bernie Sanders. We're not far from West Virginia. We have Joe Manchin. Either those two have to agree, and every other Democrat has to agree to do something on a party line basis, or you have to have bipartisan support. And there are limits to what you can do purely on a party basis. And frankly, there's lots of opportunities if members from both sides will seize it for maybe some more bipartisan cooperation. It's not just the Senate that's closely divided. In the House, based on the election results and now some people who've left to go into the administration, if 4 members of the Democratic majority vote with Republicans, the Republican side, the minority, actually prevails on a particular question if everyone is there and voting. So it's not hard to lose 4 votes on any given topic. From our perspective, this ought to be the reason for kind of setting the extremes of the far left and the extremes of the far right aside and focusing on what people who are interested in governing can do. Of course, you all know well the pressure that both the far right and the far left put on members. And I think the real testament as to whether we're going to get immigration and infrastructure and lots of other things across the finish line is if those who are willing to come together and support it, something that's more bipartisan nature, whether they prevail or whether the elements at both extremes prevail. I could give you examples right now that would lead you to both conclusions. I don't know which one's going to be right, but if I were watching something, over the next 6 months, that's the thing that I would, in particular, watch as to how productive of a Congress this could be, and how much of these national priorities we might be able to address and finally get done. Let me turn quickly and talk a little bit about the state of the economy. Man, what a difference a year makes. You've probably seen some of the stories. The New York Times had a great one over the weekend about I think they had 17 reasons that the economy is poised for explosion. Goldman Sachs just came out this morning with new economic estimates. They think we're going to get 8% growth and we can get 3.5% national unemployment by the end of next year. That might be true. You're also seeing lots of people concerned about inflation. One of the reasons is over the course of this past year, Americans accumulated $1.8 trillion in savings over and above baseline. And part of that's because of the 3 rounds of stimulus checks that I just mentioned, and the new tax credits. And frankly, that if you were going to Disney World last year, you probably didn't, and you maybe didn't take another big trip. You probably saved that money. Well, that money is just itching to kind of get out and explode onto the scene when the economy is fully reopened. And it really could turbocharge growth. It also could, if it gets too kind of out of whack, lead to inflation. There are some things that are going to keep that in check. We still have over 10 million Americans who are unemployed. That far surpasses any moment in time, even during the Great Recession. But interestingly, we have 6.8 million open jobs in the United States. Of course, the problem is if you take the list of sectors where we have open jobs and you take the list of sectors where the 10 plus million Americans were formerly employed, there is not a lot of overlap there. The professional business services, healthcare, are areas that are looking to hire, construction, warehousing services, think Amazon, Walmart, and then it's restaurants and leisure and hospitality where people were displaced. A lot of those jobs will come back, but they won't all come back. And so one of the real things that we have to manage if we want to maximize kind of the economic growth over the next year is really helping those people quickly get the skills to transition into the jobs that are open. I do think, well, in fact, we're already beginning to hear from certain sectors of the economy who sound a lot like they sounded a year ago, January, meaning that their number one problem was an inability to find skilled workers. I think that's going to grow over the course of the next year. And if we can figure out how to manage that, we're going to be able to get this growth trajectory on the right path. That and avoiding any unnecessary policy mistakes. And I think we're poised really for a breakout year, and then hopefully can get the trend line in an area that's sustainable. If you go back 10 years ago to the Great Recession, the problem wasn't that the recession didn't end quickly enough. The actual recession itself ended actually fairly quickly. The problem is that we had a decade of stagnant growth following it. We couldn't break out a 2% economic growth. That's just not enough. The post World War II average is over 3.5%. That's what all of us expect. That's the kind of growth that kind of fuels the whole concept of American exceptionalism and each generation being better than the year before. If we get this right, we can be back on a growth trajectory of 3% plus growth, which will really be replace kind of the lost decade that we experienced after the Great Recession. So I know that was a lot to throw out there. Hopefully there's some nuggets there that folks in the audience will want to explore further. I'd love to take questions about any of those things or any of the other experiences that we're seeing in Washington going on right now. But let me pause there, Betsy, and turn it back to you.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there, Mr. Bradley. There is a lot. And I think we should sort of go back over some of those things. I'm looking at some of the questions people have. I'm most interested in some of the details around PPP and EIDL and eligibility of various things. But I think what I'd love to do is just sort of pull up a little bit and since we last saw you, since you last talked to Vermont businesses, there's been a change in the administration. And certainly the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill is, getting that through has been a big, big win in the beginning months here for the Biden administration. But I'm just a little bit curious, we're an advocacy organization here, you're an advocacy organization, you're considered really a powerhouse lobbying group in DC with the US Chamber and working with all the partners on behalf of businesses. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about sort of how your team manages a change in administration, regardless of who it's from and who it's to. And then more specifically, how you see working with the Biden administration as the U.S. Chamber on behalf of businesses. What do you see? What's the prognosis out there?
Yeah, we've been around 112 years now. We've never, we do engage in politics on the congressional level. We've never engaged in politics at the presidential level because it's one or the other is going to win, and we have to work with whoever wins. And we have a pretty good track record of finding ways to work together, irrespective of the administration's party or kind of how they got there. It's also true that with every single administration, we found areas of agreement and we found areas of total disagreement where we fought, we've sued. I mean, we've gone to the mattresses for our members, if you will. And so there's this kind of misconception that the business agenda, maybe I think it's a conception here in Washington, that certain things belong to each party. Our view is, free enterprise, business, job creation is not the exclusive providence of either party. In fact, we want we want people in both parties like competing to figure out how they can do the most to create a more vibrant economy and more job creation. And if they're focused on those things, we're going to figure out ways to work with them. This administration, we know a lot of these folks. I mean, the president was obviously vice president for 8 years. A lot of the people who are around him in the administration um, were around in the Obama administration. Some of them go back to the Clinton administration. So a lot of the folks that they brought from the Hill are people we've worked with for a long time on Capitol Hill. And so it was a fairly easy transition in terms of knowing folks. Even the folks that we didn't really have a relationship with, we've been able to kind of quickly establish a relationship with. So the new Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, was the governor of Rhode Island. In all honesty, we didn't do a lot with the governor of Rhode Island. But she was one of the first to outreach after being nominated. It turns out her deputy we worked with a lot in the Clinton and the Obama administrations. But we quickly found that we had a lot of our members at the U.S. Chamber had actually worked with her when she was governor. And so there's kind of a natural rapport there. I will say everyone wants to compare the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And leaving it, I won't jump into the comparison on policy. I will jump into the comparison on process. And I do think, and even allies of the Trump administration say this: process was not the strong suit, right? There was not the government across administrations of both parties has generally operated in this what they call the interagency process, and there is a path that policy takes from the bowels of government up through stakeholder consultation, and then through the White House, and then ultimately, if no one else can decide, it gets to the president. Trump he had no care for that. He kind of liked things going straight to him and, no process. We're very much back to a process that we're very familiar with, where there's a lot of stakeholder consultation, not always agreement, but consultation. I will give you an interesting, perhaps the area that's been the most sensitive to navigate is around anything COVID. The Biden administration very much wants that there's kind of the pre-January 20th approach to COVID and the post-January 20th approach to COVID. But that's not really always true. And so on Friday evening, in fact, we were having a discussion with the folks at HHS. They're going to launch a massive messaging campaign as more vaccines come online to get hesitant individuals kind of vaccinated. And as they were briefing us, we asked, we're like, so is this the same platform that the Trump administration was using? And you could tell they were like, and we're like, no, we don't mean that in a good or a bad way. We're just curious. Are the same people who were working on it then? Oh, yeah, it's the same people. Yeah. And you're like, okay, yeah. But you can tell that there's some sensitivity around some of those things sometimes.
Well, great. Let's delve into some of these questions and see if we can work through them. You had touched on the PPP a little bit and the extension of that. There's some rules that have been changed. Some people are worried about drawing that down, but then there's also the EIDL loans that came out sort of first, if you will. And we have a question here from Bernie Carr that is there a possibility of forgiveness for these larger EIDL loans? Those are 30-year loans, though. So have you heard anything about that?
Yeah. In all honesty, I don't think there's a lot of likelihood of loan forgiveness there.
Yeah.
It's they are 30-year loans. They're very low interest rate. That's just not been kind of a focus of attention of legislators of either party. Maybe we'll see some forbearance, but there was already forbearance at the front end. Like I think it's well over a year before any initial payment on the EIDL loan. So maybe an extension of the forbearance until we're kind of, the economy really has fully turned the corner, but I don't see forgiveness in the cards.
There's a question in the chat from Emma Spett who asked about companies that were founded in 2020. And so they don't have any tax returns in 2019. We certainly seen that at the state level. We were successful in getting $340 million of the COVID relief funds to businesses for business grants. And we're now working on correcting that at the state level to work on those new businesses. Have you heard about that at the federal level? Have they taken that into consideration for new businesses?
A little bit. So a lot of these programs, in particular, well, let's start with PPP. PPP is a February 15th, 2020. If you didn't exist before then, there's really no way to qualify now. That was true for a while for some of these other programs, including, for example, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. As part of this $1.9 trillion package, though, they've expanded it. The formula looks a little different. There's a different cap on it. So, the 28,000 per employee, it actually won't be that. But if you started after February 15th, 2020, you can still gain a pretty substantial benefit. I think it's up to $50,000 through the Employee Retention Tax Credit. Even the restaurant program, there are some rules. Again, not as generous as the up to 5 million if you existed in 2019 to 2020, but there are some benefits for that are targeted to new business starts to kind of help them as well. So there's good news on that front, not PPP, but these other programs, there are some limited benefits there.
Let's sort of switch to workforce. You mentioned this in your opening comments about pre-pandemic, we had a workforce problem. And of course, we have a workforce problem with the pandemic. And then if we have anything like 3.5% or even that other number that you threw out that was just like eye-popping to me, an 8% growth rate. If we have anything like that coming out of this and into recovery, the big question for Vermont is, where do we find those workers? We have an aging population and a declining workforce participation rate. So it's incredibly important that we find enough people to go to work. And what we're finding, our numbers just came out today, and our unemployment rate now has returned to 3.2%, which is pretty great.
Yeah, that's incredible.
When you look at the numbers, what's happening is our workforce participation is going down. So 3.2% is the unemployment number, but it only takes into account people who are looking for work. A whole lot of people are not looking for work. And then when I see some of the incentives in this latest COVID package, I worry that some of these incentives have been for unemployment, the additional $300 are extended to September. During last year, I completely understood it. We were trying to keep people at home, trying to keep people safe, but as people get vaccinated, we need them to return to work. Can you help me understand the thinking as Congress was passing that? Was that conversation about getting people back into the workforce part of that conversation?
It was. I don't believe they reached the right resolution. They did reach a little bit of a middle ground, and it's a little interesting how they got to this. I mentioned the Joe Manchin, Bernie Sanders, and both those guys have to agree if they're going to do it on a party line basis. One of the biggest points of contention was on the level of unemployment benefits. And the bill that came out of the House, the bill that Senator Schumer put on the floor, was $400 in additional weekly benefits. Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, who was frankly instrumental in pulling together that package last December that kind of brought both sides together, proposed taking it back to 300 and cutting it off, I believe, in June to see where the economy was and decide then whether it should be extended. Joe Manchin signed on to the Portman Amendment. And I'll forgive if people weren't watching C-SPAN too diligently. During the week that this was considered, you probably had more important things to do. But the Senate had its longest recorded vote in Senate history. It was something like 11 hours and 50 minutes that this recorded vote. Now, all the votes had actually been taken in about the first 20 minutes. And then they left the vote open because Senator Schumer, Bernie Sanders, and others were working Joe Manchin to get him to pull his support for the Rob Portman amendment. And ultimately, Portman, or excuse me, Manchin ended up splitting the difference. The Democratic leadership gave in on the $300 versus the $400. Manchin gave in on the length of an extension, and that's how we ended up at September. That's how the sausage got made.
Sure.
But the impact of that sausage, I think you're exactly right. I very much worry that if you add in the unemployment, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, which by the way you can claim now based on your 2019 work rather than 2020 work, that you've created a lot of reasons for people just to hesitate to get back into the workforce when we need them. What proponents will tell you is, well, that's going to come to an end, and they know that, and people will want to get in the workforce. The reality that we know from practice is that the longer someone is unemployed, the harder it is for them to get back into the workforce, and the harder it is for them to get back in with the skills that they had. Skills deteriorate, jobs change, and so the real danger is that we'll have people who will have been out of the workforce for a year and a half. And once that happens, it gets really hard to get people back.
And I think that's our concern. We know that a big answer to increased workforce and increased amount of people in that age group in many other states is immigration, and it's why we're supportive of bringing new Americans, of being able to create an immigration policy that works. So we're supportive of that. But at the end of the day, we're very close. We're right on the border with Canada, and that's not really where our immigration challenges are. And it's a lot further from our southern border to get to Vermont. So in many states where better immigration policy or even existing immigration policy is helping load up the workforce, it's a long drive from there to here. And so, we are concerned about, getting every person that we can who's already here in Vermont back into the workforce, whether that's the mature worker or we work with veterans populations, various different folks to get them into the workforce. But this has a potential disincentive through September, just as we're trying to get the economy to grow and recover, because we can't do it without our employees.
That's right. That's right. And speaking of immigration, they say that there's never any new ideas. That feels largely true, but occasionally there are new ideas, and occasionally they catch hold. And one of them is actually an immigration, and it was included in the proposal that the president put forward back in January, which is to do, in addition to all the other immigration programs, which are largely either tied to family or a specific employer, the employer bringing. It has a pilot program for basically location-based immigration, where Vermont could decide, we're facing a shortage of workers. We want people to come to Vermont. We got lots of employers who will compete to hire them. And the deal is that they're coming and they're staying for, I can't remember if it's 3 years or 4 years, but a period of time where they commit to remaining, to living and working there in the location based. And this was an idea that came out of this crazy think tank in DC that they came and briefed us on it almost 2 years ago. I was like, that is really intriguing. I think there are lots of places, and it's just caught on, and now it's a real live proposal. And if we could get something like that enacted, it could make a real difference, because you're not trying to find large employers who can pay all those thousands of dollars to sponsor an immigrant. You're just saying, we got work, we need people, and we can do it. And I think that
That's
would
a
be
great
right.
idea. We'll look at, thank you. I had not known about that. And maybe that's something that we can look into and encourage our senators, Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders. Sounds like that would be right up their alley. And maybe that's something that we could work on with them. So thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question here by David Stagliano from TD Bank about the economic impact payments and who is eligible. I don't know if you know that off the top of your head. I think we can put a link in the chat so that is answered. Um,
So the general rule is, if you're a single taxpayer and you file an individual return rather than a joint return, it's $75,000 in income and below gets you the full $1,400. It phases out really quickly after $75,000 for a single taxpayer. If you file jointly, it's $150,000, and again phases out really quickly. The head of the household is um, somewhere in between those, but I'm not sure exactly where head of household falls.
um, I'm going to switch a little bit to vaccinations. I know that you folks are doing some work to encourage employers to help, and frankly, I'm a little envious when I attend calls and learn what some employers in other states are doing to help get their employees vaccinated. In Vermont, we've chosen to do almost exclusively age banding, so only based on your age. And I think that is done with all the right intentions to make sure that we save as many lives, and the elderly population is certainly more susceptible. But of course, those folks are not necessarily in the workforce, and so we're eager and anxious, and it's moving along quickly, and that's good. But I'm curious what the U.S. Chamber is doing. I know that you have some messaging going out. What are you encouraging employers to do as far as vaccinations go for their employees?
Yeah, our view is that every employer can do something, and that every employer ought to be making a plan to do their part. In some states, if you're a very large employer and you have 5,000 people at a facility, you should be working with your state public health officials. And we're trying to help streamline this through the federal government to offer vaccinations to your employees and their family, and maybe to employees in the surrounding area, because chances are you probably actually have a health clinic on site. You probably actually already offer the regular flu vaccine on site. And it really makes sense to use that infrastructure. But obviously most employers don't have 5,000 people. And even if you have 50 people or 25 people, um, people need to, employees need to know and need help navigating the information. When is it available in your community? And where can they go and get it? And I think helping as employers to gather that information and make sure your employees have it. And then if you're able, giving if someone can't go get it on the weekend or outside of normal work hours, and I'll just speak for the U.S. Chamber's perspective. It's worth it to give them a couple hours off to get them vaccinated, so that they're getting it, and that we're moving forward. And I think employers can do that as well. By the way, if you have fewer than 500 employees, the federal government will reimburse you for the time off that you give your employees to go get that vaccination. Now, you may decide the paperwork hassle isn't worth the money, but depending on the number of employees you have, it might be worth it. And I think those little incentive structures and just that information can help make a big difference. Obviously, today the problem is demand exceeds supply in terms of the vaccine. We're not that far away from where supply may exceed demand. It could be, if we were doing this a month from now, we may be in the case that what we're really talking about is trying to get people who are vaccine hesitant to go get vaccinated. And I think that is going to be the real challenge that we're going to face. You heard the president on Thursday night say by May 1st, he wants it to be available, irregardless of age bands or anything else, to every adult beginning on May 1st. When we reach that point, and we should by that nationwide, given the supply trajectory that we're on, then it's going to be really about getting those people who don't want to get it, um, helping them get vaccinated. And this is going to be a real problem. There's a story out last night. Um, the House of Representatives, Congress, House, 435 people, they've had access to the vaccine since January. Um, they're doing all these crazy remote things because people can't, come in. Their fear of getting COVID. And they've had quite a few members who've caught it. 25% of the House, 100 people, haven't been vaccinated yet because they're choosing not to. If that replicates itself in other places, we are not going to hit that herd immunity level that we need to get to. And we run the risk of these variants that you read about in the paper take over And once we end up with a variant that the vaccine doesn't work against, which has not happened yet, but the longer it goes, the more likely you are to get something like that. The more we may be going back around this loop again. And so I think anything employers can do to help with that's important too.
We're trying to get that message out. Trying to make sure that employers are at least messaging. You should, to the point that, when your turn comes, please get that. And that's probably preferable to any kind of employee mandate, which is something that has been much discussed. But so far in Vermont, employers are really looking at more of the encouragement and communication and helping people have that time to go get that or to recover from that.
One other thing, if I can just take 30 seconds, we've actually done some message testing. The message that in addition to the convenience of what employees can expect from their employer, the thing that works the best is the employer, the owners, the manager, the CEO, just saying, hey, I got my shot. I hope you'll get yours too. Right? Like it doesn't have to be a mandate, but like there's something that triggers when you know that your boss got it and you see them and they look just fine and everything's going great and they're resuming their normal activity. So if nothing else, business owners who are listening today, when you get yours, just make sure that the people around you know you did.
It's a great idea. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to getting mine. I'm just not quite yet in the right age band, but looking forward to it. I'm gonna turn our attention to a couple of really big issues here in Vermont. I think they're pretty big issues at the federal level and probably all over the country. For us, the twin big issues for us are childcare and broadband. So I'll take one of these at a time. In Vermont, we have been advocating for improvements to childcare infrastructure, and it remains a priority for businesses, for child facilities, childcare advocates, for policy leaders of all different persuasions. There doesn't seem to be any disagreement that we need more and more affordable childcare options. And certainly with the pandemic, that shined a huge light on that. But so far, the proposals that are being floated in Vermont tap out about $300 to $500 million, and that is quite a lot when you look at our overall budget. And when you put that in context, it's very hard to imagine that there's some tax increase or some cut that we could make to afford that. That's not going to happen. So we look to the federal government to help with that, and certainly seeing that in this latest package. I'm curious if that conversation about helping childcare in rural areas goes beyond just this package, and what the U.S. Chamber, what your perspective is on this issue.
Yeah, there's obviously money in these packages, but let's be honest, most of the money in these packages is focused on um, helping childcare centers stay afloat because like a lot of small businesses, they're hurting, or to reopen or deal with pandemic specific costs. I do think and I do hope it will lead to a broader conversation about how we sustain affordable childcare in a post-pandemic world. I think there's a decent chance that becomes a big part of the conversation as we head into the summer and into the fall. I don't know exactly, how much that's going to look like or exactly how it's going to be distributed. I think those are all kind of questions that have to be ferreted out. But I do think that this is a moment exposed because of the pandemic about a need that existed pre-pandemic. But also, when you're talking about workers, I mean, women, mothers, disproportionately have been pushed out of the workforce because of a lack of childcare, and in many parts of the country, schools not being open. I know you guys have your schools open, but lots of parts of the country don't, and a lot of women have just been displaced out of the workforce. And getting them back means that we're going to have to address those issues. So I'm hopeful that ultimately we will, but we don't see a plan yet that I think meets the needs that we have.
And then I think the same thing on broadband. So again, There's nobody that disagrees. We need better broadband everywhere. It's often on how do we fund that? And again, huge price tag in Vermont. I'm sure it's a huge price tag in every state. And a lot of the dollars that are coming through the COVID relief packages are, for pandemic relief. We invested some of that in sort of short-term solutions to get us through, broadband hub areas and for schools and libraries and various things during the pandemic. But at the end of the day, we still have thousands of households without access to broadband or even quality broadband. And do you see that an ongoing issue as well?
I do, and here's one where I actually think we will see. In fact, we've already seen resources. So I mentioned at the top the $1 billion that Vermont, just over, that Vermont's going to get out of this package. You can use that for anything related to broadband. It doesn't have to be COVID related. It doesn't have to be temporary. You could, if you have a broadband deployment plan for rural areas, you can use this $1 billion to go help fund that. An infrastructure bill is also going to include more money for broadband. There's just no way that, we used to say roads, bridges, and transit. Well, now it's really roads, bridges, transit, and broadband. And then the question is how far does it go beyond that? So, I think that there are resources that are now available, and there's going to be even more resources from the federal level for broadband connectivity.
Well, that's great. I think that's what we're looking for, is really thinking about the broadband pieces. When we think about all the telemedicine that has been delivered, the school lessons that have been delivered, our virtual policy series being delivered, it is through broadband. And we just, we have mountains and various things here that often make it difficult. So I think that.
And I think going back to your workforce issues, right? So I don't know if I mentioned this when we were together in November, or maybe Betsy, I mentioned it to you separately offline. I was talking to a reporter, more of a columnist who regularly covers stuff. And this is last fall. And I said, "Oh, where are you working out of?" And he admitted, and we used to live in the same neighborhood in DC. He admitted that he and his family had relocated to Vermont because your schools were open and it was a better environment. And he was doing the work for the same employer, the same columnist work from Vermont because he could do it there. I don't know if he's come back yet or not. I suspect he hasn't.
We're
But
finding that they're buying houses and they're staying. So that's good. We think that's helpful for the economy. It doesn't help our workforce issue, but it does help our economy. So I've got one last question, and then I'm just going to see if you have any last comments before we close out. So when we look at these packages, they're incredibly helpful to individuals, they're incredibly helpful to businesses and now to governments to stay afloat, but it is increasing our national debt quite a bit. And I know that once upon a time was an issue. It doesn't seem to be discussed or talked about at all. And I'm curious about your take on sort of that increasing national debt, sort of the looming prospect of inflation, and what you think that might do to the value of the US dollar long term. This is just a
um,
question before we.
yeah, no, it's a good one, and I think it's one where we have to admit that what we thought we knew may generally be true, but may not work in exactly the ways that we thought it worked. I mean, there's this great chart that I saw this morning. The national debt essentially more than doubling, and interest rates as a share of GDP that the government pays falling by more than half. How in the world does that happen? A lot more debt and a lot lower net interest payments, but that's exactly what's happened. That doesn't mean that the laws of finance or economics have been permanently suspended. They do mean that the points at which you hit brakes may be different than what we thought. To me, what is most disconcerting isn't the run up in debt for the pandemic relief. It isn't even this extra 1.8 trillion in kind of one-time savings and how that dissipates and how that works through. Because even the Fed chairman said at the end of last week, it's transitory. Yeah, it's going to have a bump, but then it goes back to trend. The thing that is worrisome is that a year ago, January, pre-COVID, And pre any of these expenses, the federal government was on pace to run $1 trillion deficit. And we thought that that was a really good economy. Generational low unemployment. We cannot run $1 trillion deficits in really good economies. And that's the thing that's going to bite us. And so as we come out of this, we shouldn't focus on what we're doing to get out of it, but we should focus on what we do on an ongoing basis in a post-COVID world. Because if we're still on that $1 trillion trend line, then things are going to blow up. I don't know exactly when, but the laws of finance, again, haven't been repealed. And so at some point, it's going to catch up with us. And we better be ahead of it, because if it does catch up with us, that's when things get scary and scary quick.
So for the next couple of months, the top 2 things on your agenda, you can only pick 2. What are those top 2 things on your agenda?
Infrastructure and workforce.
Great. Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining us again. We really appreciate getting your perspective on federal legislation and how it impacts businesses. So thank you. Thank you for being here and being part of it.
Thank you for your partnership. We love working with you and the whole team there at the Vermont Chamber. And I hope it warms up there soon.
Hopefully it will. So folks, that wraps up today's event of our virtual policy series. Thank you all for attending today, and a big thank you to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and to Neil Bradley for taking the time to join us. Next Monday at 3 p.m., please join us. Our guests will be Representative Hal Colston and Senator Keisha Ram. They're going to discuss the policy work in Vermont that promotes racial equity, supports diverse populations in our state, and grows our economy. Really important conversations. Please join us. Thank you and have a great afternoon.